Welcome to SREB Literacy Ready Science Unit 1, Lesson 2 on Close Reading in the Sciences. In this lesson, students will learn the strategy of text annotation and close reading. So the first thing that we're asked students to do is think about what scientists look for when they read, when they conduct experiments, when they write up research, because these are the types of activities that we're going to want students to be able to do by the end of this unit. So I think a lot of times students don't really think about what scientists would pay attention to when they read, and this particular lesson is going to get them started thinking in that way. So it's a really good time for teachers to discuss the importance of precision in language and learning new terminology as understanding processes. So I think a lot of times what students do when they learn science vocabulary is try to memorize bold-faced terms. So we're going to talk about learning vocabulary as learning science processes, and we'll be starting that right here in this particular lesson. In Activity 2, they're going to start to read the textbook chapters in this unit. And so they'll be reading the entirety of Belkin-Mayer Chapter 3 and 2 parts of Chapter 4. We're going to skip Section 4.2. So they'll be reading 4.1 and 4.3. So what we need to do as teachers is to talk about warming up for reading, and pre-reading or gearing up for reading is a strategy that doesn't take a whole heck of a lot of time, but one that readers often skip. But it's a really important way, especially in the sciences, to make connections to what you already know and to make connections, even more importantly, to previous science concepts that they learned. So in this unit, we're going to be talking about that, using what you know, using science concepts, using precise language. We're going to talk about the idea of purposeful rereading. So instead of skimming and reskimming, what students are going to do is read text closely and read it more than one time in certain sections for different purposes. So the first pass might be to get an understanding of what they read. The second pass might be to look at that terminology and how it's connected together. One thing I think it's really important for teachers to talk about is to keep an open mind about learning new strategies. So some of the stuff that we are teaching students, like text annotation or taking notes in a certain method, they may have seen those before. But because the tasks have changed in this particular unit, we're expecting them to really do college-level work, and because we're using them in a supported, purposeful way, they may experience these strategies a little bit differently than how they have in the past. So it's important that they keep an open mind on what we're asking them to do and really try out everything before passing any judgment. So what students will need to do for this first text annotation and close reading activity is to learn to use text annotation. And we have a section in the academic notebook on annotating in the sciences. And we actually ask students to annotate the section on annotating. So they're going to pull out the important pieces of information. It's important for them to think about, what's important for annotating in the sciences and the role of prefixes, roots, and suffixes in learning vocabulary. So not only are they going to be tying vocabulary back to science processes, we have this handy prefix, root, and suffix chart in their academic notebook that they can use as a reference throughout both science units to be thinking about how even terminology in science is quite purposeful. And once you understand the prefixes, roots, and suffixes, you often can figure out a definition even when you don't really know that concept because of the way science terminology is generated. So they're going to try out both the annotation strategies and the vocabulary strategies using the beginning of the Belkin-Mayer Chapter 3. So what do you need to know? One thing that's important to recognize is that students may resist using annotation. So it's kind of helpful to maybe anticipate some of the arguments and have some counter arguments for them. So one thing that students often say is they don't like annotation because it takes a lot of time. And so one thing that you can do is ask them to just do a cold read of a paragraph, and then the next day ask them, what do they remember from it? And then ask them to do an annotated read of a paragraph, and then the next day ask them about it, and see which one they remember better. Chances are that when students annotate a piece of text, because they're using multiple senses, right? They're writing about it, they're reading about it, they learn it a little bit more deeply. Plus, students are creating an artifact so that when they go back to the chapter, they don't have to reread everything because they've pulled out those important pieces. It's also important for them to think about how annotating is different in the different content areas. So what they annotate in history is going to look very different from what they annotate in science. So they need to be thinking about, data that supports a concept or theory, the connection between different theories, the science processes and how they work and how the phenomena occurs and where it occurs in the body and what does it show us about science. And so because they're only annotating the things that matter for science learning, they're going to find that when they go to study, they've got a lot of the work done, because instead of putting off thinking till later, and a lot of times what students will want to do is highlight or underline and then go back and learn that material later. Instead of doing that, they're learning it right now. It's also important to show annotation examples as a way to discuss what's important to annotate. And so I've given you an example that one of my students did years ago from a biology book where they're looking at chemical and physical properties. And so you can see that they've pulled out some definitions, but they've also tried to pull those ideas together, right? So there's 3 types of properties, and what are they, and where do they occur, and what are some examples of them? So it's more than just what, it's why and how and when, so that students can think about processes as a whole. In addition to this example, there's also an example for students of the process of digestion, both in the lesson plans and the academic notebook, so that you can show them several different strategies. Plus, I think it's a good idea as you're teaching this course to collect samples from students of really good work so that you have it to show later classes of the kinds of strategies and the kinds of depth of thinking that you can get even while reading the annotations of a textbook. So they're going to be looking for the most important ideas and how those ideas connect together as they annotate. So it's a good idea as they're thinking about learning to use annotation and knowing that it's a strategy that you don't get the first time. So annotation is a strategy that the more you do, the better you get. It's a good idea to have students use several different reading techniques as they approach the chapter. So we'll have them within this lesson read in pairs, read aloud. So both you and the students will read sections of the text aloud. They'll read independently. They'll read and discuss in small groups. They'll read and discuss in large lectures. And they'll do purposeful rereading where they go back to a section and take a second pass at it. This is an important strategy for getting them to read in multiple different ways with multiple different purposes so that they A, get comfortable with reading science textbook chapters, and B, get comfortable with annotating. A lot of times students don't want to put pen to paper because it makes it permanent, right? And so by talking about the ideas in pairs first and sharing those with small groups and talking about it with a class and then taking a shot at writing down what they think is important, it's a supported way for them to get into that strategy. It's also good for them to understand that there's no one right way to annotate a textbook. There are wrong ways, but as long as they're getting the important information, it's really what works best for them. We'll also be doing a strategy of text-dependent questions. So students will engage beyond what questions. If you ask students to create a test question, generally they'll come up with a what question. We want them to start asking how and why, going beyond that what kind of question. There's several assessments of annotations throughout this unit, and I think it's important for you to understand that assessing annotations is a process. So the first annotations that you read, it might not count as a grade for students so much as a progress report. So that there's an annotation checklist in the lesson plan that you can use as an assessment to say, okay, you've got this part here, but you're really missing this stuff here. Giving students time to revise, to go back and reread and redo sections of their annotations will help them hone that skill so that they're really getting the most important part. So in Lesson 2, there is a checklist for you to use, but it might, again, just be sort of a formative assessment so that you can see where students are and give them feedback on where they need to go. This lesson ends with a weekly reflection, and every week within the 6-week unit, students will reflect on 2 things. What did they learn about the science, and what did they learn about science learning? And so they'll have time to write up a reflection on learning at the 2 levels in their academic notebooks. So for this week, think about the science. What would scientists pay attention to if they were looking at a new energy drink on the market? And then they would think about how they're learning, what's changed in the way they approach reading in the sciences, and more specifically, what about that annotation strategy? How did it impact the way that they read in science, and what did they like about the strategy, and what did they dislike about the strategy? Every week they'll end with this kind of a reflection so they can think about what they learned both in the sciences and in terms of reading and writing in science. And that ends Lesson 2.